Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Last week I showed you how I put together a new custom watercolour palette and I've been really looking forward to testing it out. So this week I'm going to show you how I painted the bright colourful feathers on this cockerel bird. I'll be trying new colours, experimenting with new colour mixes and talking you through how I paint realistic looking feathers. So I hope you enjoy the video. All the supplies I use today will be listed in the video description below, along with a link to the reference photo from Pixabay if you want to go and check it out or try this one out for yourself. So with all that said, let's get started. I began by sketching out the cockerel onto my watercolour paper just using a regular graphite pencil, and decided to use a bit of masking fluid to preserve the tiny highlight on the cockerel's eye and on the whitest feathers on the back here. Once that was dry, I was ready to start painting. I started off on the cockerel's head with Winsor & Newton's Winsor Red. And you can see how watercolours do tend to bead on new palettes, but I'll soon break it in. Winsor Red is a beautiful, almost transparent red that leans slightly towards a cooler colour temperature. And I painted this onto dry paper to both keep control on these smaller areas as well as to keep the colour nice and bright. Watercolour does often dry slightly lighter though, even if you aren't diluting your paints with much water. So once the first layer had dried, I went back over with more Winsor Red to the comb and wattles and added some quinacridone gold and Indian red around the eye. These are two more Winsor & Newton professional colours. The Quin Gold is transparent whilst the Indian red is opaque, but I really think they help to add depth to the face. For the beak I used watery indigo and added in some more quinacridone gold and a bit of burnt umber, letting the colours mix together on the surface of the paper. The indigo is one of my tried and tested favourite watercolours from Schminke, and the burnt umber is fast becoming a new favourite from Daniel Smith. I moved on to paint the hackle or neck of the cockerel next, and for this area switched up to a larger size 8 round brush and began by pre-wetting the paper first with clean water before adding any paint. There are a lot of tiny feathers here, but rather than paint each one individually, I thought I'd go for a looser wet in wet look and add the suggestion of feathers later on. I started with watery quinacridone gold again and dropped in a more concentrated mix of the same nearer the head whilst the paper was still wet. I pulled out some of the paint onto the dry paper here to suggest some small feather detail, but there's also a really light bright area here too which I want to try and reserve. Around the ear and earlobe I added burnt sienna and used light sweeping strokes with the tip of my brush to suggest the direction of feather growth. The burnt sienna I have is a transparent one from Sennelier. Whilst that's drying, I can now go on to paint the first lightest layer on those amazing tail feathers. Unlike the neck, here I am aiming for more detail as they really are stunning. I painted the first layer wet on wet and mixed together Prussian blue and Viridian. These are two single pigment Mission Gold watercolours that when mixed together created a really pretty teal colour. I painted this all over the tail feathers, being careful to observe any shapes around the edges of the feathers but not worrying too much about any other details for now. At the tip of the tail feathers I also introduced some burnt umber and let it bleed together with the teal colour on the surface of the wet paper. Here, even though I wasn't aiming for detail, I did try to apply the paint in the direction of the feather barbs, but I'm going to add more definition with further layers. I added some burnt umber around the darker neck and shoulder feathers of the bird too, still painting wet on wet, but here I drop in some of Daniel Smith's Lunar Blue just to add interest and a bit of texture. Then it's back to more burnt umber, only this time it's a bit more concentrated and I dab it on loosely with the end of my brush to create the suggestion of some feather shapes. I make sure to leave some of the lighter areas showing from underneath. There are some more teal feathers under this area too, so I add those in using the same paint mix I used for the tail feathers. I add yet more burnt umber in little upside down V shapes to create a bit more depth and separation between the two feather colours. Working down the wing, I apply a more watery teal mix and drop in some Magenta blue. This is a Mission Gold watercolour which has a bit more of a red undertone to it. I haven't used it much before, but I do really like it. Now, as before, whilst allowing those feathers to dry, I move on to paint a different part of the bird. So here I'm painting the longer saddle feathers of the cockerel. I use burnt sienna again and apply it onto the dry paper using longer tapered strokes with my brush. I also leave some of the white of the paper in between my brush strokes, as well as on the area of the back where the light will be hitting. For a bit of variety, I add in some of Winsor & Newton's Indian Red over the burnt sienna and carry this colour round onto the wing, still painting onto dry paper. I just love how many different colours I'm getting to try out on just this first layer. But it's back to a dilute burnt sienna again to lay down a base layer onto those lower wing feathers. I'm still not putting in any detail to speak of yet, but I can start to paint in some of the feather separations with a slightly more concentrated burnt sienna once the feathers dry. Onto the breast of the bird next, and this appears almost black in the reference photo, but I begin with a wet in wet layer of burnt umber mixed with indigo, and this creates a more interesting brown black. I apply it generously over the whole area, dropping in more pigment onto the paper whilst it's wet and painting my brush strokes in the direction of feather growth to add a bit more shape and form. I don't spend ages on this part, but I don't want to just paint it as one flat colour either. Now before I paint the background, I just need to go in and paint the feet, and for this I use Daniel Smith's Lunar Blue again. This has a really lovely granulation to it, which I thought would be an easy way to add in some texture here. The painting is completely dry now, and for the background I wanted to paint in something soft, loose and subtle, but that would also emphasise the light reflecting off the cockerel's back. I opted for a wash of burnt sienna and applied it onto wet paper, but was careful to keep the area dry that I wanted to keep white. I softened out any edges using a clean damp brush and added some splatters using burnt umber. With the background and the initial layer on the cockerel dry, he is definitely starting to come to life. But to really make him pop off the page and look realistic, I need to build on that first layer and add more detail to some of those feathers. So now I'm going to go back to those wonderful tail feathers, and I've switched back to my smaller size 3 brush here, and this time I'm using a mixture of Winsor & Newton's Perylene Green and Mission Gold's Peacock Blue. These are both beautiful transparent colours, so will be really good for adding glazes and details while still allowing the underneath teal layer to shine through. I start by outlining the central rachis or vein of the feathers and soften out any hard edges using a clean damp brush. I also start to add in some of the darker barbs just using the very tip of my brush. And to define the outside edges of the feathers, I also use the negative painting technique. Negative painting is where you define an object or shape by painting around it instead of painting the object itself. You can see what I mean on this feather here. I'm using the darker watercolour to paint around the feather and define the shape that way. And again on this top feather. I use the same technique to add more detail to the wing feathers. Here I'm using more concentrated burnt sienna and first paint the darker shadow area underneath the feather before pulling some of the paint upwards to further define shape and add in some of the barbs. I also pay close attention to the direction of these barbs and keep checking back to my reference photo to remind me. But it's not all about the details, as for a painting to look realistic it's also really important to get your values right. In fact, probably more so. And the more I added more layers to one area of the painting, the more it highlighted other areas that needed attention too. On these blue feathers here, for example, to balance out with the values on the rest of the painting, I needed to go in with a much more intense colour. So as well as the teal, I also dropped in some French ultramarine onto the damp paper too. This is another Winsor & Newton watercolour, and being transparent glazes over other colours really well. On this area here though, I didn't have a ready-made watercolour that was the shade I was after, so I experimented a bit and mixed Sennelier's permanent magenta and burnt sienna together to create the purpley brown hue you see me using here. I used this colour on the shoulder as well. And to help add separation to some of the longer feathers here. Next, I layered over another new watercolour to my palette, Winsor & Newton's Transparent Orange. This is a beautiful, bright and luminous pigment that I've really enjoyed using recently, and it really helped bring these feathers to life. When it came to adding more depth and definition to the smaller neck feathers, like I said, I was aiming to paint more the suggestion of feathers than painstakingly rendering each and every one. And I did this just by observing the length and direction of feather growth, by looking at some of the shapes that are formed between the feathers, so like little V shapes for example, and by building up layers. And in this way you can quite quickly and easily build up the impression of realistic, fluffy looking feathers without too much trouble at all. Applying transparent glazes is also another quick and easy way to add depth or change up the colour of an area. Here I try adding a glaze of Core's transparent green gold, and then suggest a few more feather shapes by painting negatively again. It's subtle, but it all helps and it's fun to try things out. At this stage in the painting, it's just a case of touching up and looking at it as a whole to see what improvements can be made generally. So I redefine the features on the face and add a bit more detail to the feet. I go over the tail feathers again with another layer of perylene green, burnt umber and a bit of burnt sienna, just to deepen up the colour a bit and bring it more into line with the reference photo. I'm not worried if it's not exactly the same, but I still want to make the values right so there's enough contrast and depth. The dark chest feathers also need to be darker, and here I'm layering over Daniel Smith's Moonglow. This transparent colour is a beautiful 3-pigment mix, and although you can't see the colour separation too well over the top of the indigo and burnt umber layer, it still adds a bit more depth and interest to this really dark part of the painting. I applied it to dry paper and used sweeping strokes with my brush again in the direction of feather growth as before, and let some of the previous layer show through in parts to add variety and texture. And then with the paper completely dry, I finished off by using an old bristly paintbrush to add some darker paint splatters. I think this helped to ground the cockerel a bit and balance out the composition as a whole. I just used leftover colours on my palette. With that all dry, all that's left to do now is to remove the masking fluid. I used a Frisk mask away tool for this and really enjoyed revealing those lightest, brightest areas, which gave the painting the contrast it needed to really come to life. It was a lot of fun to paint too, and I really enjoyed trying out some new colours and some different colour mixes on these bright cockerel feathers. But let me know what you think and leave a comment below. If you like this video, please also give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you're watching for the first time, and hit the notification bell to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you all so much for watching, take care, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!